programs, as well as the binational centers. And as Giselle said, we've had 2 days of the network of binational centers meeting Thursday and Friday. Today was the last day, about the network of the 13 centers that we have. And it's great to have this as sort of a cap to that session for me, because I've been here 2 weeks now. So I'm learning about all the programs and all the support that we provide, and all the partnerships we have with our great Argentine partners. So I'm really excited to hear the program today, and to see some faces that hopefully I'll meet in person one day. We'll see.
Thank you. If you agree, we can start admitting the participants and start with the webinar. As Argentinian, we are not starting. I don't remember if it is on time or on time, but I think that it's a great moment to start. Okay. Bueno, muy bien. ¿Se escucha bien?
Perfecto.
Bárbaro, gracias. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon to everybody. Vamos a tratar de hacerlo medio bilingual. Mi inglés tampoco es, he perdido. I've lost my fluency. I hope any of my teachers from my high school hear me today, because they would be very sad. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos nuevamente en este seminario intensivo sobre elecciones en Estados Unidos, elecciones presidenciales, actividad que se desarrolla en el marco del American Studies Program, que está apoyado, supported por la Embajada de Estados Unidos en Argentina. Seminario organizado especialmente por el Observatorio de Política Internacional de la Facultad de Derecho y Ciencia Política de la Universidad Católica de Santa Fe. En el día de hoy nuevamente nos acompañan los colegas y amigos de la Universidad Católica de América, the Catholic University of America, great friends, great colleagues, and a great partner for us in terms of internationalization. Nos acompañan también autoridades de la Embajada de Estados Unidos en Argentina, nuevamente y especialmente hoy, Michael McLean, que es el nuevo agregado cultural de la Embajada. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you, Michael, for being here today. Y en el día de hoy va a moderar, y es un honor, va a moderar esta actividad Lidia López, que es mi colega, mi par en the Catholic University of America, y que está desarrollando una iniciativa muy interesante vinculada con la internacionalización en términos de la incorporación de académicos y de cultura vinculada con Latinoamérica e Iberoamérica también en the Catholic University of America. Nos acompaña también Laura Alemandi como representante fiel de Alicana, uno de los 13 centros binacionales que los Estados Unidos tienen en la República Argentina. Bueno, brevemente las preguntas las pueden hacer a través del chat y las vamos a ir leyendo una vez que terminen las presentaciones. Cabe aclarar que Dale Crowell ya lo conocen y habla muy bien el español, but John White speaks Spanish, but he preferred to speak in English today. Así que vamos a... John va a hablar en inglés y por supuesto que si hay algún impedimento para entender lo que está explicando, desde ya que, no yo, pero seguramente los demás van a poder apoyar con la traducción para que toda la audiencia pueda entender y apreciar lo que tienen seguramente muy interesante para contarnos hoy. Así que, bueno, Olivia, te cedo el espacio para que vos puedas iniciar con las presentaciones y muchísimas gracias en nombre de la Universidad y del Observatorio por todo el apoyo para acompañarnos en estas iniciativas.
Gracias, María Luisa. Buenas noches a todos. Gracias por la participación a los estudiantes, profesores, investigadores y todos los demás colegas presentes hoy. Soy Livia López, la directora asociada del Instituto de Estudios Latinoamericanos e Ibéricos en la Universidad Católica de América y LAIS. También ministro clases de Derecho y Política con enfoque en América Latina. Una breve nota otra vez, perdón a los que estuvieron presentes en el primer panel, porque repetiré, pero quiero destacar que nuestro instituto y LAIS tiene dos brazos principales, que son la promoción de estudios latinoamericanos e ibéricos y también la realización de iniciativas relacionadas con América Latina y la península ibérica, que es propiamente exactamente el caso de este evento y del programa de American Studies. Y me gustaría muchísimo agradecer en el nombre de la Universidad Católica de América, the Catholic University of America, a la Universidad Católica de Santa Fe, especialmente a su Departamento de Cooperación Internacional con doctora María Luisa, a la Facultad de Derecho y Ciencia Política y al Observatorio de Política Internacional por la invitación a la Universidad Católica de América para desarrollar conjuntamente 2 de los 4 paneles del seminario intensivo Elecciones presidenciales en Estados Unidos, que es parte del programa de estudios americanos. Muchas gracias otra vez, es una satisfacción, una grande satisfacción para nosotros contribuir para la consolidación de la colaboración entre nuestras instituciones. Quiero también agradecer otra vez más al Departamento de Política de la Universidad Católica de América en la Escuela de Artes y Ciencias, especialmente al profesor Dr. John White y también a Dale Crowell, que es miembro del programa de doctoramiento del departamento, que hoy serán los panelistas a hablar en nuestro tercer encuentro sobre la influencia de las minorías en la elección presidencial. Y por fin, pero no menos importante, mis agradecimientos también a nuestros colegas de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos en Argentina por el soporte al programa y también al Ministerio de la Educación y su área de internacionalización. Gracias a todos y sin más retrasos podemos empezar las presentaciones, como María Luisa dice, en inglés con Dr. John White y claro, Dale y yo también estaremos acá para asistir con las preguntas, las respuestas o cualquier problema en la presentación que necesiten de ayuda. Por favor, gracias. Dr. White, please.
Well, thank you. And thank you everybody for being here and taking time out of your day. I really appreciate it. And let me, excuse me, let me just say that my Spanish goes back to high school, which, as you can tell, was a very long time ago. So I will present in English. I hope that's all right. But I also look forward to a dialogue with everybody here. We are 4 days, a little less than that now, than to Election Day in the United States, and what Americans say, and I think correctly, is the most important election of their lifetimes. We have a lot of political disagreements in the United States, but most Americans of either party believe that to be true. I want to talk with you a bit today about population trends in the United States as it relates to minority groups and Hispanics in particular, and then talk about the composition of the American electorate, particularly as it relates to minorities. Let's just start with some big picture analysis, if you will. First, the United States is headed in the 2040s to be a majority minority country. That is on track, despite the Trump administration's efforts to restrict immigration to the United States, to limit immigration to the United States. That is a fact. The Census Bureau has a disagreement about what year that will happen. The latest is 2050, earliest is 2042, a middle is 2044. But when we say majority country, what we mean is that whites will be a minority throughout the United States. And that is assured. Now, that is an enormous change in the country, but what does that mean? What does that look like? For Hispanics, what that means is that in 10 years, Hispanics will be 1/3 of the American population. They are the leading minority group in the United States. And just to add to this, this has upended our politics, particularly in places like Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia. In Virginia, Hispanics are the leading minority group. They outnumber African Americans. When we look at minority groups, of course, Hispanics have been among the fastest growing. And that really began in 1965, because what happened at the end of the Kennedy administration, President Kennedy had advocated immigration reform. The last immigration reform, well, I see the chat. We'll get to the questions for sure. But immigration reform really had become an urgent issue by the mid-1960s, because during in 1924, the Republican president, Calvin Coolidge, the Republican Congress shut off immigration to the United States, particularly from Southern Europe, from Ireland, etc. They put quotas on the number of immigrants that could come into the United States. This became, over time, even more intolerable because obviously not only were we discriminating against Southern Europeans, but we were also actually discriminating against Eastern Europeans caught under the Iron Curtain. And so Johnson took up the Kennedy mantle and proposed immigration reform. And when he signed that bill in 1965, one of the things that he said was, this is not going to change the United States very much. And that making that statement over time, that has proved to be totally incorrect. It changed the United States dramatically. And what it began to do was to open up migration, particularly from Mexico. Johnson had a long-standing friendly relationship with Mexican Americans, going back to his earliest days when he was a school teacher in Texas. Yes, Lyndon Johnson was at one time a school teacher and taught Mexican American children. And of course, he again saw the perhaps a political opportunity, but for him, it was certainly a moral question. beginning in 1965, we began to have a wave of immigration to the United States. And from then, at least until the last year or so, that wave of immigration, which includes Mexico, but actually includes, of course, significant immigration from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. It also includes immigration from Haiti. It includes Asian migration to the United States, which has also been hugely significant. And so when you look at that pattern of migration, it is the greatest wave of migration in American history. It far outnumbers emigration from Ireland in the 1840s to the 1890s. And from 1890 to 1924, that was a huge wave of migration in American history. And that migration is everywhere. We sometimes think that, of course, when we think of migration and we think of American states, we think of California, Texas, states along the border, Arizona, New Mexico, and so forth. That's true, but that is wrong. Because as I said, we've seen large Hispanic migration in places like Virginia, in Georgia, which is a very significant Hispanic population in Georgia. And one of the things that we've seen when we look at minorities is that if you look at African Americans in terms of both the birth rate, but particularly when it comes to the percentage of the American electorate, they are actually very stable as a percentage of the total American electorate. So that migration is hugely important. It has changed the character of the country. And when we have large migrations to the United States, it typically has produced a backlash against immigrants. When the Irish came, they were predominantly, overwhelmingly Catholic. We saw Catholic churches that were burned because prior to that, we had a very homogeneous country in terms of race, religion, and so forth. Beginning in the 1840s with that potato famine, we began to see that large migration. Prior to that, one historian, I don't like the term, but he talked about those immigrants as being strays. It sounds like an animal or a dog.
There is a wonderful monument in Boston related to the potato famine. I don't know if you know.
Yes.
If you've seen it.
I am very familiar with that. That is an excellent point. So then we began to have that a reaction was no Irish need apply for a job. When we got to the 1890 to 1924 immigration, it was, here are people that don't speak English. Here are people whose religious affinities were different again from the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And the reaction built up in a way that the Republican Party seized on that by cutting off immigration, by putting on very strict quotas. Now, if you were from Great Britain, you could emigrate to the United States very easily. And this wave of migration that began in 1965 also has produced a backlash in the United States, because we've seen that with the passage in many states of English-only laws, where you must speak English. We've seen that in terms of people fearing that the migration also, again, changing the face of America, a face that has moved from white to some form of bronze in the 21st century. which a pollster friend of mine described. And that is certainly true. We've also, at the same time, that backlash raises important questions, because becoming an American does not mean that you inhabit the soil. It's really that you subscribe to a set of ideas, a belief in freedom, individual rights, equality of opportunity. And so it's always a complex fate being an American, because we're constantly asking ourselves, what does it mean to be an American? And when we have large waves of migrants, that pushes that question, I think, to the fore. There has been, during the Trump presidency, a very significant shift in public opinion when it comes to immigration. In 2016, a plurality of Americans believe that immigrants hurt the country. They don't help the country. Today, that has flipped, where Americans see immigrants as strengthening the country, helping the country. And then let's get down to numbers, because if the best numbers that I can find come from the Pew Research Foundation, and they estimate that there are 12 million legal immigrants in the United States. But they also say that there are about 10 million in the country illegally. These are people that either crossed the border illegally or came in with a visa and then overstayed that visa. And as they have stayed in the United States, they do pay taxes, they do work, they do have families. So their children, under our Constitution and the 14th Amendment, those children born in the United States are automatically American citizens. So there's simply no way that you're going to take 10 million illegal immigrants and put them on a bus or a plane or whatever and send them back to their home country. While Americans see that immigrants help the country, that does not mean that they want open borders. They want border security as well. And so it's fusing both of these things together. So again, by mid-century, we are talking about an immigrant population, a minority population that is a majority. And you might think, well, okay, that seems very simplistic, Professor White. But what about when it comes to race? Because race was never easy in the United States. That is racial classification. I have a New York Times reporter friend that did the genealogy of Michelle Obama. And Michelle Obama has white relatives. She has a Native American ancestry. Of course, she has African American ancestors. We think of the former First Lady as being African American, but in fact, it's more complicated than that. Today in the United States, if you look at interracial marriage in the United States, it is on the rise. So about 15% of all marriages are interracial marriages, and those marriages are producing children. The United States government now allows the people to mark more than one race on the US Census and on other federal forms, actually an innovation produced by Newt Gingrich. So President Obama, when he filled out the census form in 2010, could have checked African American and white. He did not. He checked African American only, but he could have done that. And we find with the 18 to 29 generation, the millennial generation, that a large number of them did check more than one race. So even when we talk about Hispanics in the United States, what do we call them? Hispanics, Latinos, Latinas. Some self-identify as white. So race is very complicated, and racial classifications are a kind of slippery slope in the country today, for sure. And that picture is not going to change. White birth rates, by the way, I saw that question, have been falling. So we see a birth dearth in the United States among the white population, and that continues for sure. And in this election, this electorate for the first time is going to be dominated or have a plurality of millennials and Gen Z. That is that 18 to 30 voter. And they will outnumber for the first time the baby boomers, those born after World War II to 1964, of which I'm one. So that is a huge shift in the country. It was inevitable that that would occur. I mentioned Asians in brief. The recent numbers showed them to also be on the rise in terms of migrating to the United States. And this is an interesting group in particular, because again, Asians are an important minority group in states like California. They have shifted their political allegiance considerably. So back in the 1980s, many were Republican, identified with the Republican Party. That has completely reversed. And now they very strongly identify with the Democratic Party. So this overall picture is changing very dramatically. How does it change the composition of the electorate? And the answer is quite significantly. So if we go back to 1980, which is the election of Ronald Reagan, and just look at all voters in that election in the United States, they were 89% white and 11% African American. Hispanics were less than 1% of all voters in 1980. Again, we have exit polls from 1980. The Hispanic number shows up there, but it is a very insignificant number. When we look at 2020, this is a hard one. If we look at 2016, Hispanics were rising to 12% of all voters. It looks as though that they're going to be somewhere in the 15% range, maybe higher, come Tuesday. That is a function both of population, of people that have been in the country for a while, and this is important because not everyone who comes to the United States legally or becomes a citizen of the United States necessarily votes right away. It takes a while to assimilate. And we may be seeing that gestation period emerging now in this election in a very significant way. So that in a state like Texas, here's what we know today. Of course, Texas is a majority-minority state, but their early voting will close at 8 o'clock Eastern time. I don't know what time. It's 6:30 Eastern time now. So in another hour and a half, the polls will close in Texas for early voting. and then people can vote on November 3rd, on Tuesday. But we know already that the number of early votes cast in Texas is already more than the total vote in 2016. And we know where that explosion is coming from. It is coming from Texas border towns like El Paso. It is certainly coming as more Hispanics are making every effort to vote, but it's also coming in suburbs. We can talk about that because this is a big development in the United States. And while I mentioned suburbs, I should say that suburban communities are no longer white communities. They are populated by large numbers of minority groups. In my Maryland suburb, more than 70% of the public school students are minority. And so we're not only talking about Hispanic and Asian and Vietnamese and you name it, up and down the line. And by the way, those young people are what we do have polling that shows that they are dating people of a different race, or that they've had a serious relationship with somebody from a different race. Let's go back to the composition of the electorate. 40 years ago, 89% white, 11% African American. If we go to 2008, which is the election of Barack Obama, that electorate was 74% white, 26% minority, and of that 26%, 15% was African American. If we had the same composition of the electorate in 2008 as existed in 1992, when Bill Clinton was elected president, we would have been speaking about President John McCain. There was absolutely a shift, I guess, in thinking, a shift from thinking about the American voter as young, poor, Black, which was the majority in 1980. Young, poor, Black, white, middle-aged, middle income, a frequent church attendee or going to mass regularly, lived in the suburbs. That was Ronald Reagan's America. Ronald Reagan's America is no more. So when Obama was elected, his race was not a liability, it was an asset. It was a tremendous asset to his candidacy. And African-American turnout rose to 15% of the total electorate in 2008 and stayed there in 2012. It fell to 11-12% in 2016. And remember that Donald Trump was elected in 2016 while losing the popular vote in the Electoral College, which you may ask me about. But basically, he was elected out of 136 million votes cast. He was really elected by 77,000 votes total in 3 states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Winning those states gave him the presidency, but he won them by the skin of his teeth. But African-American turnout was down in those states. Had it been at the 2012 level, Hillary Clinton might be seeking re-election today. When we look at the composition in I mentioned minorities, whites were 74% of all voters in 2008. They were 72% of all voters in 2012. They were 70% of all voters in 2016. So even though that white number is going down, Donald Trump was able to get more whites who had never voted before and run up the score in rural America, particularly among white, non-college educated voters. That is the heart of the Trump base, small town America. Towns that Mitt Romney won by 15, 20 points, and Trump was winning them by 40. And we've seen that big shift in our politics. The problem for Republicans is that they have to find, if their strategy remains the same, even assuming that Trump is reelected, they have to find more white voters. And as we move forward in time, that gets increasingly difficult. Now, if we look at 2020, what we should see is, first, it's likely that we're going to see an electorate that's about 68% white total. In other words, that number goes down about 2 points every 4 years. That's simply because of the shifts in population, the exit of older voters, new voters coming in to vote. This year, we're looking at a total voting population, I think, that will be somewhere around, I think, 154 million, which is a record, a complete record. That just so we're looking at a voter turnout not of 60%, which is what we had in 16, or almost 62% in 2008, which was a high watermark. We're probably looking at a turnout approaching 70% of all voters. Let's talk about the Hispanic vote in particular, because it's not so easy. It's a complicated vote, and it varies significantly by what are we talking about here. And again, to lump Hispanics together and say, well, okay, they're the leading minority group, this should bode well for Democrats. Well, that's a very serious mistake to make. First, we do have, particularly in Florida, a Cuban-American population whose Republican roots really go back to the Bay of Pigs during the Kennedy administration, and their fierce anti-communism, and of course their fierce dislike of the Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and all things Castro. Trump, I think, did something very smart for them, which was to try to cast the Democratic Party as being socialist, and basically making the argument that only he could prevent the United States from turning into a socialist country. I think that would have been an easier argument to make for some other potential Democratic nominees. It's a harder argument to make about Joe Biden, because Biden has basically been a centrist and a moderate all of his life. I think that would be a very easy argument to make against Bernie Sanders. Florida also has, and it's a crucial state, has a large Venezuelan community. And they too are sensitive to that socialist argument. If we look at Puerto Ricans, which are a very significant population also in Florida, particularly those that emigrated after Hurricane Maria, of course, they are automatic US citizens. And Puerto Rico will actually be voting on statehood as to whether they would like to be America's 51st state in this election. We'll see what they do. Prior presidents, going way back to Gerald Ford, actually did support statehood for Puerto Rico. They tend to be very much in the Democratic column. Certainly those that Hispanics that emigrate from Mexico tend to vote fairly overwhelmingly Democratic. Now, I think the reason for that is that the message they've gotten from Trump is, we don't like you, we don't want you, go back to where you came from. I believe, however, that to classify them as Democrats is also a mistake, because that party identification, I think, is weaker. It's not an automatic thing. And a lot of this depends on results. I think the message that Democrats are communicating when it comes to DACA, for example, and just when it comes to immigration in general, is that immigrants strengthen the country. And that's a powerful message in certain places. So if you look at the state of California, which is a majority minority state, Biden is beating Trump by 36 points in California. Ronald Reagan's home state is no longer a place where Republicans compete in any serious way. And some analysts look at California and say, this could be the political future of the United States, particularly if the Republican Party doubles down on Trump and Trumpism. Because again, just the sheer demographics alone suggests that. And we've seen this happen in other states too, Virginia, North Carolina, and Texas. And let me just say one little bit, and then I really want to get to your questions. But we have an electoral college. We don't elect the president by the popular vote. Joe Biden will win the popular vote. There's no doubt about it. Perhaps win it, I think win it decisively. So if he doesn't, we'll have another seminar where you can say you said. But the Republican anchor states in the Electoral College, the states that just should be theirs, are Texas and Florida. And the Democratic anchor states are really New York and California. Democrats don't spend any money advertising in New York or California. They extract money from those states. Republicans now have to defend Texas, and they have to defend Florida. They've always had to defend Florida, but Texas is new. So this is kind of where we are. I think that we are certainly on the cusp of a potential major shift in American politics. But let me add one caution. There was an old saying that demography is destiny. In other words, you look at a population, you look at the voting population, and you begin to extrapolate from trends what is going to happen. This is a fundamental mistake made in 2016. You just look at the growing minority population. Hillary Clinton should be president. Candidates matter too. They just do. Hillary Clinton was extremely unpopular with the American electorate. Fair or unfair, she was very unpopular. And so too was Donald Trump. Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton. He's actually, I think, a much more formidable candidate and didn't bring to the election the baggage that Hillary Clinton brought. I think Democrats understood that, which is why they nominated Biden. They didn't nominate him for ideology or because he was a leftist or a progressive or socialist. They nominated him because they thought he was the best candidate to beat Donald Trump, So beating Donald Trump was priority number one for Democrats. And I see a question in the chat, and then I'm going to open it up for your questions so Deo can translate. But I would say that I saw the question about the media. We're seeing, of course, we're seeing advertisements in Spanish. That is a foregone conclusion. What I think is interesting for Hispanic voters in particular is an old-fashioned medium called radio. And it is a very important medium for those voters. And we're seeing both parties advertise significantly on radio. When we think of media, we tend to think today of social media and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and so on. But in fact, radio is an extremely important medium. So I see both occurring. I've talked too much, and I certainly want to get to your questions. I do see more up in the chat. So I'll turn it back to Maria Luisa or anyone that may want to ask a question.
Thank you, Dr. Wise. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was excellent. All the points that you addressed. Thank you very much. Yes, and let's open to the Q&A, and Dale, we work on this together. Please, you can send the questions in the chat.
Now, I did see a question about the vice presidential candidate, which I took to be but she is more left. I'll be honest, Americans don't vote for vice president. They just don't. They vote for president. I think part of the Harris is certainly 21st century in the sense, okay, you know, both, again, with her, race is complicated, right? Because she is the first Asian or someone of Indian American background.
Mira la última pregunta que hizo, decime si lo saca o no. Ay, la puta.
So I just to finish that up, I think that her value will be to the extent that she can lift African-American turnout, and there's mixed reviews of whether she can do that or not. Well, I see other questions in the chat. I don't know how you want to do this.
Yeah, if you prefer, you can see directly, or we can see, since people are asking in English, you feel free to just answer. But if you prefer, we can ask you what do you prefer? Just see directly and address the question.
I'm very happy to do whatever you would like. I want to give everybody a chance. I do see one question about the political culture of the United States. And I would say that, you know, it really does boil down to three things. It boils down to this overwhelming belief in freedom or liberty, in individual rights, and equality of opportunity. That's the core. So America is always an idea more than it is a physical space. And of those three, freedom, individual rights, and equality of opportunity, equality of opportunity is actually the most important, because freedom can be taken away and individual rights can be taken away. But the belief that you and I are equal to each other. I'm no better than you. that's a state of mind. And that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Olivia.
Oh, you go ahead, Dale. Do you want to?
I'll let you go, please.
Okay, so yeah, Lucia has one question about the early voting. Why do you think that people are doing early voting, and why there are so many people?
We have Gallup poll out today that shows that 77% say that this election matters more than previous years. That's it. Now, I think also early voting numbers are up because of the pandemic. So, early voting tells us something, but I'm not sure that any of the prior rules about early voting apply this year because of the pandemic. So people are voting either by mail, or they're early voting, or they've got a ballot and they're dropping it off in a drop box. So I think that's a big change. Big change. And we just, there's stuff we know and stuff we don't. So I don't know what the early vote means, but I do think that Americans are engaged in the election. And the Gallup data also shows that Americans of both parties say that they've given considerable thought to the election. And that's interesting. And in terms of by party, in terms of does the election matter, 85% of Democrats say yes, 79% of Republicans say yes. And in 2016, those numbers were roughly reversed. So 80% of Republicans back then said the election mattered. Only 69% of Democrats said the election mattered.
Yeah, so the other question is, considering that Trump is such a controversial person, why have Republicans chosen him as a candidate?
Well, the weakness of the Republican establishment and the leadership of the party basically atrophied. And so it was there. I think there were two reasons. One is they no longer had the power to select Donald Trump. And if it had been up to the party leaders in 2016, they would have never chosen him. But the Republican base was really angry over things like immigration, feeling left behind when it came to the economic recovery, particularly in rural America where jobs were leaving, particularly upset about the decline of manufacturing, upset that they were being had by a corrupt Washington establishment that didn't think of them or their interest. And so they were willing to take a chance on Donald Trump. The biggest difference now is that Donald Trump has been president for 4 years. And what we've seen is we see this rise of minorities, and we see non-college educated whites in particular still very strong for Donald Trump. The biggest shift now has come from both women and college educated voters and suburbs. Those three have moved decisively to the Democratic Party. And that was enough to propel the Democrats to take over the House in 2018. It's going to be something we're going to watch carefully on Tuesday. But that is a big shift. And it happened in 2018, and it looks like it's continued in 2020. That ought to be enough to give Biden the presidency.
And one thing I'd like to add, Dr. White had mentioned Texas. is a very interesting case happening right now. Particularly, he mentioned it's okay, if it's okay, Dr. White, I'm going to speak in Spanish for a second. Que el Dr. White habló del estado de Texas, que es muy interesante, que es en las zonas fronterizas donde hay la gran concentración de la población hispana. Ellos sí están votando a niveles más altos que antes. Y también en las zonas alrededor de las ciudades en Texas, pero especialmente en el condado alrededor de la ciudad de Houston. Es muy interesante allí en Houston, porque Houston también ahora es creo que es una de las ciudades más grandes ahora en los Estados Unidos. Creo que es la quinta más grande en los Estados Unidos. Y la población de Houston ahora refleja más o menos la población mundial, porque hay inmigrantes que vienen de todas las partes, no solamente de América Latina y el Caribe, pero también de Asia, de Medio Oriente, de Europa y otras partes del mundo. Y entonces es la experiencia que los inmigrantes que están integrándose más allí en el proceso político en Houston y en Texas, que posiblemente sí están surgiendo y saliendo a votar a niveles más altos que hemos visto en mucho tiempo aquí en los Estados Unidos.
Yeah, you don't have to translate, Dale. I got it.
Okay.
I got it. I think that's absolutely, you're absolutely right. There are a couple of other questions I see in the chat that are also kind of...
They are asking about the use of social media by pop stars and famous people trying to suggest their followers to vote for someone or for another one. And what's your opinion on this?
Right. So we've had Facebook that is now supposedly banning political advertising on the eve of the election. One of the things I would look at with respect to social media, so social media is here, it's not going away. It has a very significant political influence, but in the United States, anything that you put on television or radio is highly regulated by federal law. And both what you can say, what you can't say. That's not true for social media. I would not be terribly surprised if we're talking about this in the next couple of years, that we see some of these large social media companies like Facebook, Google, Instagram, Twitter, broken up. I think there's actually an interesting convergence between some conservatives on the Republican side and progressive Democrats that want to take a serious look at social media. So I think it's hugely important, but it is the Wild West when it comes to political advertising, for sure.
Yeah, so the other question is, which political party is doing better with minorities, if any?
Yeah. Well, overall, of course, it's the Democratic Party. So if you look at that 30% that is minority of all voters, that is Democratic territory. But I don't know that that's Democratic territory in the future. And I don't think this is something that Democrats should take for granted. By the way, younger African Americans have loosened their ties somewhat to the Democratic Party. I think in part because the achievements of the civil rights era in the 60s were 60 years ago. The big shift, I think, on the Republican side is a real shift away from Ronald Reagan and the first George Bush. Ronald Reagan saw Hispanics as future Republicans. They would come to the United States, they would be successful, they would own their businesses, and that their views about government, taxes, and also their cultural conservatism would align with the Republican Party. Reagan opposed building a wall He wanted amnesty for those that were in the country illegally. George H.W. Bush in 1980, you can go to YouTube and see it. It's a debate they had in Houston, Texas. George Bush the first was asked whether children of illegal immigrants should attend Houston public schools for free, and he answered yes, they should. They should be going to public school. That there should not be a permanent underclass, and that is a big shift from today's Republican Party, I think, for sure.
Also, I would, otra vez en español, mi observación, también yo quiero decir que es posible que también en la comunidad puertorriqueña hay unas tendencias hacia el Partido Republicano. Por ejemplo, muchos de los líderes elegidos en la isla de Puerto Rico en este momento son republicanos. Y los últimos dos residentes comisionados que representan la isla en el Congreso, en la Cámara Baja de los Estados Unidos, son afiliados con el Partido Republicano. Y entonces también, aunque que hay una gran población de puertorriqueños que ahora están en el estado de Florida y también, por ejemplo, en el estado de Pensilvania, que son dos estados muy claves para esta elección, hay un porcentaje por lo menos que está subiendo un poquito de aporte hacia el Partido Republicano en la comunidad puertorriqueña. Y es una cosa que, como el doctor White dijo, que los demócratas realmente tienen que prestarle atención hacia esta población si ellos quieren conseguir sus votos en el futuro. Just another observation. I was talking more specifically. Okay.
No worries, I get it.
I figured.
Do you want to go there, or do you prefer that I go?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, so one question, the other question is about how Republicans and the Republican Party will adapt to this new face of the voters and the new, considering the minorities and the immigration, how they can adapt to this new reality.
They had a tentative step after losing the presidency in 2012, where the Republican Party, after that loss, produced something called the Growth and Opportunity Project, where they argued that the party needed to reach out, particularly to Hispanic and minority voters, that they needed to make a concerted effort, that the message that the party had been delivering was, we don't like you, we don't want you, we think you should go back where you came from. In 2012, Mitt Romney, the Republican candidate, proposed that the immigration problem should be resolved by illegal immigrants self-deporting. He used that word, self-deport. And this report excoriated Romney for saying that. And it looked as though the Republicans were beginning to move in a different direction. Donald Trump upended all of that and went in the complete opposite direction. But I would add the other, I mentioned the popular vote before. So if you go back to 1992 through 2016, the Republican Party has won the popular vote once, which was in 2004. That's, yeah. And so that's not a great track record over that long a period of time. And if you look at the Democrats, well, they were around 48% of the popular vote, 49% with Clinton, 48-48 with Gore, although Gore had more popular votes. In 2004, Bush had 51. McCain went to 46. Romney went to 47. And Trump was at 46. So, you know, it's not a winning strategy. The problem is that in certain states like California, New York is another, the Democratic majorities are so overwhelming that when we look at the popular vote, where Hillary Clinton basically, you know, had 2.8 million more votes, that's a lot of votes, than Donald Trump. Well, where did that come from? A lot of that came from her overwhelming majorities in New York and California. But again, over time, I think the party will have to address that. But candidates matter too. It's not just all demography. Candidates matter as well.
Okay, and the other is, what's the role of outsiders of politics to influence voters?
Yeah, Americans have had a penchant, a desire to elect outsiders to the presidency. You know, you either spend very little time in Washington, or you're not from Washington at all. So you think of Bill Clinton, for example. Barack Obama was a senator for only a brief period before becoming president. While George W. Bush obviously was the son of a president, he had not spent any time in Washington. He'd been governor of Texas. Donald Trump, of course, the complete outsider, no government experience whatsoever when he was elected in 2016. I think this year is totally different. First, Americans, I think, well, the data basically shows this. They don't want less government, they want more government. And we are dealing with a healthcare crisis, an economic crisis, a racial crisis, and a climate crisis. So Americans, I think this time, are looking to someone with experience in government, that is actually, for the first time, a real asset in seeking the presidency. I just think that's where we are in 2020. So I think they want government to do something about all of that. And they see crises and national emergencies all around them, which again is why they're so engaged.
Okay, and the other one is, do you think that Donald Trump can refuse to leave office in case he loses?
Well, no. The constitutional, he may refuse, well, his term of office expires at noon on January 20, 2021. There's no getting around that. Now, of course, if it's close, if we have disputes about mail-in ballots, the courts can intervene, you know, and so a lot of stuff could potentially happen. But if Biden is the clear winner, has an electoral college majority, Trump essentially has to leave at that point. That doesn't mean that he leaves on friendly terms. If you go back to the election of 1800, John Adams, who lost that election to Thomas Jefferson, didn't attend Jefferson's inauguration. He left Washington at 4 o'clock in the morning by carriage to head back to Massachusetts. So that's one example. And we've had other examples where the transition and the relationship between an outgoing president and an incoming president have not been friendly. Franklin Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover are good examples of that. My guess is if the win is decisive, which the polling suggests it is, then I think that's pretty much it. And I don't think that the Republican Party in that scenario would be inclined to support Trump.
And there are two or more people asking about the same topics. There are the scandals and the accusations against Biden's son and its effect in the elections. And what do you think also about the media, the role that the media is playing regarding this when we consider free speech or when we consider that they are covering up?
Well, I'd say two or three things. One is there's still tremendous suspicion about Russian involvement in that particular issue and whether that information can be trusted. And I think the media is skeptical about reporting some of that. But I think there's a larger point. Americans don't see the election about Hunter Biden. They see it about themselves. So it is what is this what is this election about? It's about my life, my family, my health, my economic security, personal security, and so forth. So the voters, you can't tell consumers what they should like or what product they should buy. It is really about them. And I think in the end, that's how Americans view this election. It's about them. And what are you going to do for me? How are you going to help me? So I think that's why that story hasn't resonated either. You can't tell voters what they should pay attention to and what they shouldn't pay attention to. They'll figure out what they should and shouldn't do.
And someone is asking about the US-China relations after the elections. And what do you think about it?
Well, certainly our relationship with China, Russia, right at the top. There's no question about it. China is certainly a competitor to the United States. There is absolutely no question about it. And one of the key, I think, elements in the 21st century, it's very important, is that the United States is or remains a Pacific power, and China certainly is challenging that. So it's not just an economic challenge, and we will have a very competitive relationship with China, I think, particularly whoever is elected president, frankly, because I just think it will be competitive either way. Obviously there'll be differences, but I think that both candidates are looking at how do we protect American industry, American copyrights. They disagree about the methods for doing that, but I think that's true. I think the relationship with Russia will change significantly if Biden is elected. That is going to be, I think, more confrontational, and there will be much more emphasis on cybersecurity in particular, because essentially what Russia is doing, according to our intelligence agencies, is basically waging a new kind of Cold War against the United States and American democracy.
And about the Justice Amy Coney Barrett and how it will affect the elections?
Well, Well, we don't know. Uh, we really don't know. She will affect she will potentially affect the Supreme Court for decades, which is certainly one of the things that Donald Trump and the Republicans in Congress delivered on. That's for sure. However, the size of the Supreme Court, the number of justices, is not set in the Constitution. Congress must legislate the number, and the current number of 9 has varied throughout American history. So in Abraham Lincoln's time, there were 10 justices. Early on in our history, there were 7. So the number 9 is set by statute. And I think that Americans are very skeptical about increasing the size of the court. But that doesn't mean that Congress can't legislate on that matter. Whether Justice Barrett gets involved in these issues and any election dispute is actually totally up to her. So any justice can say, I'm not going to get involved in a particular case because I have a conflict of interest. But that is up to the justice to make that decision. We don't have a hard and set rule, really, that says she can or cannot be involved in an election case that has Donald Trump at the center of it.
Okay, and the last one, also because we are running out of time, is which candidate do you think that would make a greater impact to the benefit of Argentina's economy and politics?
Oh, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I do think that one of the, I think I would be looking very carefully to answer that question, which we don't know today, would come during the post-election period, and particularly no matter who wins, right? Who's appointed in key positions in the State Department? If Trump is reelected, I don't really see Secretary Pompeo remaining terribly long as Secretary of State. He has other political ambitions. Obviously, if Biden wins, you want to look at not just the Secretary of State, but you want to look at the sub-cabinet positions particularly. And I think that would tell you a great deal, as well as things like the ambassadorial appointments and so forth. Those are the real clues that you want to look at. I will say that when you're an incumbent president seeking re-election, you don't really focus on a transition because you're already president. For the out party, Congress has appropriated monies once a candidate is nominated to begin a transition process. And so the Biden campaign has been very engaged in transition matters, both in terms of thinking about personnel. They have a transition committee, the head of that committee, and so forth. Now, they're not going to talk publicly. They've been very tight-lipped about anything regarding a transition because you can't take an election for granted. But those are the things that will answer that question, I think.
Thank you. So I think that's it. Thank you
very
much.
You.
Yeah, for the answers. And do you want to say something? Sorry.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to participate. I suspect all of you will be watching what the United States does on November 3rd. It may take a while. So my final word to everybody here is patience, patience, patience. Be patient. It's going to take us a while to figure this out. and we may not know on November 3rd. We'll get some clues, but we won't have a final answer. So be patient, everybody. And hopefully we'll do this again someday. I enjoyed it very much. And I want to thank you, Livia. I want to thank Maria Luisa. I want to thank Dale Crowell for taking the time to be here today.
Oh, we thank you. We appreciate it a lot. It was wonderful and very interesting to discuss those hot topics. And we will be paying close attention, of course. And Maria Luisa, and thank you, Dale, again, also for adding your comments. Thank you very much. As usual, your Spanish was wonderful. And Dr. White, thank you very much too. Maria Luisa, do you wanna wrap up with comment?
I just want to thank you again for your time, for your availability and generosity to share your point of view. From a great and academic point of view, I would say, it is wonderful to learn from you, despite the different points of view that we may have related to the elections. It is a pleasure to hear what you think and what you know from your academic background, mainly. I think that maybe that is something that all of us should learn of, because sometimes it's really difficult to teach. I am a professor, to teach and not to give your own point of view in something. Politics is always in everything nowadays. And I think that it's a great example for all of us, for our students, to know that we can discuss different points of view with respect and from a technical position, I guess. So thank you very much to John, to Dale, and to Livia, because I think that apart from learning about this this frame of the election, we are all learning that we can discuss and we can learn from something strictly related to politics and to ideology with respect, mainly. Thank you very, very much, because your presentation was perfect.
Bien, gracias también a todos los presentes. Otra vez, muchas gracias. Buenas noches a todos.
Thank you.
Gracias, Dale. Muchas gracias. Gracias a todos. Gracias a Michael McLean por acompañarnos, a Giselle de la Embajada, a ambos, a Laura Alemandi desde el principio, y bueno, y felicitaciones a nuestro equipo del Observatorio de Política Internacional una vez más. Es un placer desarrollar esta actividad, así que bueno, nos queda, para la audiencia, nos queda una última conferencia en el marco de este seminario intensivo sobre elección presidencial, así que los esperamos. Ya pronto vamos a subir a la web la información sobre el último evento. Los invitamos a nuestros amigos de Catholic University of America, if they want to join us on the last webinar. Y ojalá que, bueno, este sea el comienzo de muchas iniciativas más entre el equipo que conforma Livia, John y Dale, y bueno, y nuestro querido Observatorio de Política Internacional especialmente.
Thank you.
Claro, siempre. Muchas más van a venir. Adiós. Gracias.
Gracias, Livia.
Buenas noches.
Bye. Thank you.